Once upon a time, there were 5 sisters who all lived unmarried with their parents. The problem was that their dad, Mr. Bennet, didn't really have that much money. Consequently, their mother was on a quest to marry each daughter off to a wealthy man. Then, Charles Bingley, super rich, came along and rented the Manor of Netherfield Park, fairly close to Longbourn where the Bennets live. Charles and the eldest Bennet sister, Jane, hit it off immediately. While Charles and Jane were getting along very well, it wasn't the same story for Elizabeth, the second Bennet sister, and Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy was very arrogant and thought that he was better than the Bennets because he was richer than them. Elizabeth began to hate him immediately. On her visit to see Mr. Bingley in Netherfield, Jane caught a cold because it was raining outside. Elizabeth showed up out of concern for her sister's health. Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth were practically forced to be around each other for several days, and Mr. Darcy began to develop actual feelings for her. However, Mr. Darcy wasn't the only one with his eyes on Elizabeth. Mr. Collins, who worked for Mr. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine, was a contender for Elizabeth's hand in marriage, as was George Wickham. Charles threw a huge ball at Netherfield, and in the end, Charles ended things with Jane, and Elizabeth kicked Mr. Collins to the curb. Mr. Darcy finally proposes to Elizabeth, but she shuts him down because of his previous arrogant behavior when they first met, and the fact that he took Charles away from Jane. Mr. Darcy decides to write Elizabeth a very heartfelt letter, explaining his actions and deeply apologizing for the way that he acted. Darcy goes back to his estate in Pemberley and sees Elizabeth with her relatives, the Gardiners. Darcy was on his best behavior, and Elizabeth doesn't hate Darcy anymore because of the beautiful letter he wrote her. Right when they were about to have a happily ever after, Elizabeth is informed that her younger sister Lydia ran off with Wickham, which would ruin the Bennet family's reputation. Mr. Darcy finds Lydia and Wickham and paid off Wickham so that he'd get married to Lydia to fix the Bennet family's name. This was supposed to be a secret, but Elizabeth found out and started to like Mr. Darcy even more. Mr. Darcy asks for Elizabeth's hand in marriage once again, and this time she accepts. The story ends with 3 of the 5 Bennet sisters happily married. And that's just a short summary of Pride and Prejudice.